Welcome back to the Problem Tenant Chronicles Volume 1. If you're a landlord or even thinking about becoming one, the stories, the kind that make you say, like, you won't believe what my tenant did now.
Oh, yeah.
So every Wednesday, we dive deep into these tricky situations, kind of arming you with the knowledge and strategies you need to navigate the wild world of rentals. And speaking of expert guidance, let's give a shout out to our sponsor, Flowers and Associates.
Yes.
They're the go-to folks if you're interested in special needs housing. Not only can it be incredibly rewarding, but they can show you how to make it a reliable source of passive income. Plus, they offer free workshops to help you boost and stabilize that rental income. Definitely worth checking out. Give them a call at 901-445-8148. Okay, so are you ready to tackle 3 more common problem tenant scenarios?
Oh, I'm ready.
Trust me, some of these tactics are pretty surprising.
What's so fascinating is how these tenants find loopholes you wouldn't even imagine.
Right, like our first scenario is the clause evader. Imagine this. You've got a single-family rental, and the lease clearly states the tenant is responsible for yard maintenance. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
But then months pass, the lawn's looking more like a jungle. Weeds everywhere. Random junk is piling up. Neighbors start complaining. The city might even be sending fines, and your tenant's like, oh, I had no idea I had to do that.
Yeah, it's almost comical, but legally it can be a real headache. They sign the contract, they can't just claim ignorance, and that's why having that rock-solid documentation from the very beginning is so crucial.
Okay, so let's break down that documentation. What should landlords be focusing on here?
Think of it like building a case file. So you want a copy of that signed lease, obviously,
Yeah.
but also detailed photos and even videos of the property's condition before the tenant moves in. Timestamp of everything. And if there is any pre-existing damage, make sure it's noted in writing and acknowledged by both parties that way. If a dispute arises later on, you've got clear evidence to support your claims. So it's not just about proving what the lease says, it's about proving the condition of the property at every stage.
Precisely now. Our source today provides a 5-step solution for dealing with this clause evader. And the first step is a sit-down with the tenant lease in hand.
Okay.
Walk them through that yard maintenance clause, maybe even give them a fresh copy, just to refresh their memory.
And I imagine this conversation is more than just like reciting the rules, right?
Right. It's about setting the tone for a respectful but firm landlord-tenant relationship. You can even offer guidance, provide a simple yard care checklist or suggest affordable landscaping services in the area.
Yeah.
It's like saying, hey, I understand yard work isn't everyone's favorite thing, but here are some resources to make it happen.
So it's not about being a dictator, it's about providing solutions. I like that approach. What's the next step?
Well, you need to move from a friendly chat to official documentation, and that means sending a formal written notice with a clear deadline, say 10 days to get the yard in shape.
This establishes a paper trail showing you're taking this issue seriously and giving the tenant a reasonable opportunity to comply.
Gotcha. So document the conversation, send a formal notice, and then...
This is where it gets interesting. Proactive measures, our source recommends adding a clause in your leases for periodic inspections.
Okay.
Now, this doesn't mean you're barging in every week, but it gives you the right to check on the property's condition, say, every quarter.
Okay.
That way you can catch issues like a neglected yard before they become major problems.
I can see how that would save a lot of headaches.
Yeah.
It's about staying ahead of the curve, right?
Exactly. And if, despite all these efforts, the tenant still refuses to maintain the yard, well, most leases allow you to deduct landscaping costs from the security deposit.
Okay.
Of course, you'll want to carefully document those expenses, but it's a way to protect your investment and ensure that the property stays in decent shape.
This all makes perfect sense. But sometimes even the best documentation doesn't solve the problem, Like, I had a tenant once who swore up and down this massive stain on the carpet wasn't their fault.
Oh no, what happened there?
We went back and forth, but luckily I had taken super detailed photos of the unit before they moved in, like close-ups of everything, including that pristine carpet.
Wow.
And when I showed her the photos, she suddenly remembered spilling a whole bottle of red wine proof is king.
It's amazing how a few photos can just save so much hassle, right? It shows the tenant you're serious, and it gives you that solid foundation if you need to take further action. Speaking of tenant actions, are you ready for the unauthorized renovator?
Oh, this one sounds like a doozy picture.
Yeah.
You pop by a rental for a routine check-in and you walk into chaos. Your tenant has gone full-on DIY renovation.
Oh.
Crazy. We're talking new paint, sure, but also, wait, where did the bathroom fixtures go?
Oh my gosh, this is where it can get really tricky legally and financially.
Yeah.
We're talking potential damage to the property's safety hazards if things aren't done correctly, and even problems with insurance policies if unauthorized work impacts coverage.
Yikes. Okay, so let's say you're a landlord facing this situation. What's the first step?
Documentation.
Of course.
Just like with the yard situation, you need a clear record of the property's condition before any unauthorized work is done.
So if you don't already have those detailed move-in photos and videos, get them ASE.
Absolutely. And once you discover the unauthorized renovations, document those as well. Take photos of everything, make detailed notes about what's been changed, and if possible, get a professional assessment of the work's quality and any potential damage.
Okay, so you've got your evidence file now. You've got to confront the tenant, right? How does that conversation go?
This is where clear communication is key. But so is diplomacy. You need to explain to the tenant why unauthorized alterations are a problem, emphasizing potential damage liability issues, and the fact that they've breached the lease agreement.
But what if some of the changes are actually not bad? Like maybe they replaced that ancient faucet with something stylish and functional.
Well, that's where things get interesting. Our source talks about the importance of compromise. If the work is well done and you're okay with the changes, you could agree to keep them, but there have to be stipulations. Make sure everything's properly installed and up to code, and get a signed agreement from the tenant stating that they'll cover any future damage related to those alterations.
So it's about finding that balance between enforcing the rules and being flexible when it makes sense.
Exactly. And of course, this is a great learning experience for you as a landlord. Update your future lease agreements to include a much more detailed clause about modifications, maybe even requiring upfront deposits for approved projects. This can help prevent similar situations down the road.
It's like, hey, I get it, you want to personalize your space, but let's do it the right way. Now, this brings up a question for all of you listening. Have you ever dealt with a tenant who went rogue with renovations? We'd love to hear your stories. Share them on our social media. You might just inspire our next deep dive.
All right, ready to move on to our third tenant profile. This one's a bit of a head-scratcher, the unauthorized occupant.
Ooh, this sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Imagine this. You rent a one-bedroom apartment to a single occupant. Everything seems fine, and then poof, an extra person appears seemingly out of thin air.
Like a roommate just materialized from another dimension.
Pretty much. And while it might seem harmless at first, unauthorized occupants can lead to all sorts of issues.
Like what? Why do landlords care so much about who's living in their property?
It boils down to a few key things. First, there's the wear and tear on the property. More occupants mean more use of appliances, plumbing, and everything else, which can lead to increased maintenance costs and faster deterioration. Then there's the question of liability. If something happens on the property, you could be held responsible, even if the person involved wasn't on the original lease. And of course, it's a direct violation of the lease agreement, which erodes that foundation of trust and clarity.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is a bigger deal than it might seem at first. So what's the solution when a mysterious extra resident pops up?
Our source emphasizes clear communication and a well-defined process. The first step is that crucial sit-down lease in hand, just like with the other scenarios. You need to point out the clause about extra occupants and explain the potential consequences of violating that clause, which could even include eviction.
So it's not about being heartless, it's about upholding the agreement they signed.
Exactly. Now, if the tenant wants to add the occupant legally, that's a different story. You'd need a formal request, a background check, on the new occupant references the whole 9 yards.
And I imagine the rent would need to be adjusted to reflect the additional wear and tear and potential increase in utility usage.
It's about protecting your investment and ensuring that everything is above board. If the tenant refuses to cooperate or tries to sneak someone in, that's when you might have to consider more serious actions like initiating eviction proceedings.
This highlights why setting those clear boundaries from the very beginning is so crucial. Being upfront about occupancy limits, guest policies, and the consequences of violations can save a lot of headaches down the line.
I couldn't agree more. Now, are you ready for a tenant tactic that's a little more strategic?
Oh, this sounds ominous. Lay it on me.
Buckle up, because this one takes us into the world of weaponized code complaints.
Code complaints weaponized. Okay, I definitely need to hear more about this.
Imagine this. A tenant falls behind on rent. But instead of talking to you trying to work something out, they start flooding code enforcement with complaints. We're talking a dripping faucet, a slightly loose doorknob, maybe even something as vague as bad vibes in the apartment.
Wait, bad vibes is a code violation?
You'd be surprised at what some people try to report. The point is these complaints, whether legitimate or wildly exaggerated, are a tactic. Each code enforcement visit creates delays and puts pressure on the landlord, giving the tenant leverage to avoid paying rent or to try to force you into concessions.
So they're using code enforcement as a shield, essentially.
Exactly. And it can be incredibly frustrating for landlords who are genuinely trying to maintain their properties and work with their tenants. Now our source breaks down a 6-step solution for dealing with this tricky situation, and you'll notice a familiar theme here. Documentation is your best friend.
Okay, so this is where all those detailed move-in photos, videos, and records really come into play.
Absolutely. You want to be able to demonstrate a clear pattern of responsiveness and proactive maintenance, keep records of every interaction with the tenant, document any maintenance requests or repairs, and take photos or videos of the property regularly to show its condition. Visual evidence is hard to argue with.
So it's about creating a bulletproof record of your efforts to maintain the property and address any genuine concerns.
Precisely. Now, step 2 is about being proactive. Consider having a licensed inspector evaluate your property regularly to ensure you're fully compliant with all local housing codes. It's like a checkup for your rental, and it can help you catch and fix minor issues before they become code violations or fodder for complaints.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're already on top of things, it's harder for a tenant to claim neglect, right?
Exactly. Now, even if you're proactive and have great documentation, a tenant might still file a complaint. What do you do then?
Well, from what we've been discussing so far, I guess communication is still key. But how do you approach a conversation with a tenant who might be using code complaints as a tactic?
Okay. You're on the right track. You need to communicate. But it needs to be structured and strategic. Send a formal written notice to the tenant acknowledging their concerns, outlining the steps you're taking to address the issue, and requesting specific details about any other issues they believe need attention.
So it's a blend of acknowledging their concerns, showing you're taking action, but also setting clear expectations.
Exactly. That notice should also remind the tenant of their obligation to pay rent and emphasize that filing code complaints doesn't automatically excuse non-payment.
It's like saying, I hear you, I'm working on it, but let's not forget about the basic terms of our agreement.
Yeah.
But what if they continue to withhold rent even if the complaints are minor or unfounded?
This is where things can get legally complex, and it's crucial to have a good property attorney on your side. They can guide you through the eviction process, help you build a strong case based on the tenant's behavior and the documented evidence, and ensure that your rights are protected.
So even if it's frustrating, you don't want to go into this kind of situation alone, get expert legal advice to navigate those tricky waters.
Precisely. And, sometimes those legal complexities can work in your favor.
Oh, how so?
Well, if those code complaints turn out to be baseless or intentionally malicious, you might even be able to countersue for damages. Things like lost rent, due to the tenant's actions, legal fees you've incurred, and even potential damage to your reputation as a landlord.
Wow. I had no idea you could countersue in a situation like this. What does that involve?
A counterclaim is essentially you saying, hey, their actions have caused me harm, and I'm seeking compensation for that harm. It sends a message that weaponizing code complaints has consequences.
I bet that makes some tenants think twice before trying to play that game.
It can definitely act as a deterrent. Now, I know this has been a lot of information to process. We've covered some intense scenarios, and it's clear that dealing with problem tenants can be a real challenge.
It's definitely a lot to think about. But like you said earlier, knowledge is power. Understanding these common scenarios and having a clear plan of action can help you navigate these tricky situations and protect your investment.
And remember, we're here to help you every step of the way. As we delve deeper into these tenant troubles, it strikes me how vital the lease agreement itself is.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the bedrock of the whole landlord-tenant relationship, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. It's not just a formality. A well-crafted, comprehensive lease can be your secret weapon in preventing so many of these headaches.
I bet you've seen some real head-scratcher situations arise from, poorly worded or incomplete leases.
Oh, countless times. Ambiguity just breeds disputes. That's why clarity is paramount. Spell everything out, anticipate potential problem areas, and ensure that both you and the tenant understand their rights and responsibilities right from the start.
It's all about setting those expectations up front, establishing clear boundaries so everyone's on the same page.
Precisely. And if an issue does arise, always refer back to the lease. It's your roadmap, your guide to resolving disputes fairly and effectively.
Speaking of disputes, let's circle back to a scenario that can really put a landlord's patience to the test weaponized code complaints.
Ah, yes. The tenant who seemingly transforms code enforcement into their personal litigation team.
Oh, it's a classic tactic, unfortunately.
Sadly, it is a strategy that some tenants employ to try to delay rent payments or gain leverage in other disagreements. They bombard code enforcement with a barrage of complaints, hoping to overwhelm you and create a sense of chaos.
Yeah, you're right. It does feel like a chaotic game of whack-a-mole sometimes,
Yeah.
trying to address a never-ending stream of minor complaints.
The truly frustrating part is that many of these complaints are often for minor issues, easily fixable things, or even completely fabricated. But the problem is, even a minor violation can trigger an inspection, which drains time and resources for both you and code enforcement.
So what can landlords do to protect themselves from this strategic complaining besides, that meticulous documentation we've already talked about?
Well, think of it as building a fortress of proactiveness regularly. Having a licensed inspector evaluate your property is a great first step. This helps ensure that you're in full compliance with local housing codes. It's like giving your rental property a thorough checkup, catching those minor issues before they snowball into bigger problems.
That makes a lot of sense if you're already staying ahead of maintenance and repairs. It's harder for a tenant to make a legitimate case for neglect.
Exactly. Now, let's say, despite your best efforts, a tenant does file a code complaint. What's the best approach?
I imagine the first instinct might be to panic. But based on what we've been discussing, I'm guessing a level-headed response is key.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and defensive when you receive a complaint, but it's crucial to stay calm and remember you have rights as a landlord.
So take a deep breath, review the complaint carefully, and then what's the next step?
Communication is still your most valuable tool, but it needs to be strategic and well documented. Send a formal written notice acknowledging the tenant's concerns and outlining the steps you're taking to address the issue.
So you're showing them you're taking their concerns seriously and that you're committed to finding a resolution.
Precisely. But it's also essential that this notice firmly reminds the tenant of their obligation to pay rent, emphasizing that code complaints don't automatically give them a free pass on their financial responsibilities.
Yeah, it's about setting those boundaries again,
Yeah.
right? Making it clear you're willing to work with them, but not be manipulated.
Exactly. Now, if the tenant continues to withhold rent without legitimate justification, or if the code violations are deemed serious by the inspector, you may need to consider more serious legal action.
And this is where having a good property attorney becomes absolutely essential. What do you say?
Absolutely. A knowledgeable attorney can guide you through the complexities of the eviction process, help you build a solid legal case based on the tenant's behavior and the documented evidence you've gathered, and ensure that your rights are protected every step of the way.
It's like having a legal expert in your corner navigating that complex legal landscape. But even if you have to go down that road, it sounds like having that meticulous documentation will be invaluable.
You're absolutely right. It demonstrates to the court that you're a responsible landlord who diligently cares for their property and addresses tenant concerns promptly. It can also help refute any claims of neglect or unresponsiveness.
Yeah, it really all comes back to that foundation of documentation. But what happens if the code complaints turn out to be baseless or intentionally malicious? Are there any legal options for the landlord in that situation?
Yes, there are. In some cases, if you can prove that the complaints were filed in bad faith, you might even have grounds to countersue the tenant for damages.
Wait, you can countersue a tenant? I had no idea. What kind of damages would this cover?
A counterclaim essentially allows you to seek compensation for the harm their actions caused you. This could include lost rent due to the tenant withholding payment, any legal fees you incurred to address the complaints, and even potential damage to your reputation as a landlord if the tenant spread false information.
Wow. I bet that makes some tenants think twice before trying to weaponize code complaints.
It certainly can act as a powerful deterrent, but, even with all these legal strategies and proactive measures, sometimes the best way to avoid problems is to carefully select your tenants in the first place.
Ah, the screening process. That's where it all begins, right?
Exactly. Taking the time to thoroughly screen potential tenants can save you countless headaches down the road.
What are some of the key things landlords should be looking for during the screening process?
It's a multifaceted approach, first and foremost. You want to get a clear picture of their financial stability, verify their income, check their credit history, and look for any red flags that might indicate a pattern of late payments or financial instability.
So it's not about discriminating against anyone. It's about making sure they're financially capable of meeting their rental obligations.
You got it. But it goes beyond finances. Reaching out to previous landlords is crucial. Ask about their experience with the tenant, any issues they encountered, and whether they would rent to that tenant again.
It's like getting an inside scoop on their track record as a tenant.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of your intuition during the application process. And in-person meetings, pay attention to how they communicate their level of respectfulness. And whether you get a good feeling about them, sometimes your gut instinct can be surprisingly accurate.
So trust your gut, but back it up with thorough verification and due diligence.
Precisely. And if you're ever feeling unsure about a potential tenant or have questions about the screening process, don't hesitate to seek advice from a trusted property manager or attorney. They can provide valuable guidance and help you navigate the complexities of tenant selection.
That's a great reminder. Sometimes getting that expert advice up front can save you a world of trouble down the line.
Now, speaking of expert advice, let's not forget about our friends at Flowers and Associates if you're interested in learning more about special needs housing and how it can become a reliable stream of passive income. They're the folks to talk to.
That's right. They offer free workshops on increasing and stabilizing your rental income, packed with valuable information and strategies. Give them a call at 901-445-8148 to learn more.
All right, that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive into problem tenant scenarios.
We've covered a lot of ground, from lease agreements and documentation to the ins and outs of code complaints and strategic tenant screening.
But there's still more to explore. Join us next Wednesday for the final installment of the Problem Tenant Chronicles Volume 1.
We'll be tackling even more tricky situations and giving you actionable advice to navigate the wild world of rentals. Until then, happy renting. As we've been dissecting all these challenging tenant scenarios, it makes me wonder, is there a way to prevent these problems from happening in the first place?
Well, that's the golden question, isn't it? And while there's no magic bullet to completely eliminate tenant issues, there are definitely proactive steps that landlords can take to build stronger relationships with their tenants and minimize the risk of these conflicts arising.
Okay, give me the inside scoop. What are some of those proactive steps?
Well, it all starts with communication, which we've touched on throughout this deep dive, but it's worth emphasizing again because it truly is the foundation of a healthy landlord-tenant relationship.
Right.
Be clear and upfront about your expectations from the get-go. Respond to tenant inquiries promptly and professionally, and be open to feedback.
It's like any relationship, communication is key.
Exactly. And it's not just about talking at your tenants. It's about actively listening to their needs and concerns and making a genuine effort to address them proactively.
So you're advocating for more of a partnership approach rather than the traditional landlord-tenant dynamic, which can sometimes feel a bit adversarial?
Precisely. When both parties feel heard and respected, it fosters a sense of mutual understanding and cooperation. And, don't underestimate the power of small gestures.
Oh, I love it. Tell me more about these small gestures.
Think about it. A simple welcome note. When a new tenant moves in, a small gift card during the holidays. Maybe even a quick check-in after a maintenance issue has been resolved to make sure they're satisfied. These little acts of kindness can go a long way in building goodwill and showing your tenants that you value them.
It's about creating that human connection, showing them that you're not just a faceless landlord, but someone who cares about their well-being.
Exactly. And remember, happy tenants are more likely to take good care of your property, pay their rent on time, and be good neighbors. It's a win-win for everyone involved.
So it's not just about avoiding headaches. It's about cultivating a positive and mutually beneficial rental experience.
Absolutely. And sometimes preventing problems is as simple as taking the time to choose the right tenants from the start.
Yes, the all-important screening process. It all starts there.
You got it. The screening process is your first line of defense against potential problems. Take your time, do your due diligence, don't cut corners, and trust your instincts.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the key elements of a thorough tenant screening process?
It's multi-layered. Start with verifying their income and employment history. This ensures they have a stable financial foundation to meet their rental obligations. Then delve into their credit history. Look for patterns of late payments, outstanding debts, or any red flags that might indicate financial instability.
So it's not about discriminating against anyone. It's about making a responsible assessment of their financial capability to handle the rent.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just numbers. Contact their previous landlords and ask specific questions about their experience with the tenant. Did they pay rent on time? Were they respectful of the property? Were there any noise complaints or other issues? Would they rent to this tenant again?
It's like getting a glimpse into their past behavior as a tenant.
You got it. And during the application process and any in-person meetings, pay attention to how they communicate. Are they respectful? Do they ask thoughtful questions? Do you get a good feeling about them?
So you're saying to trust your gut instincts as well.
Absolutely. Sometimes your intuition can pick up on subtle cues that might not be obvious on paper, but remember, always back up your gut feelings with thorough verification and documentation.
So it's a combination of thorough background checks, reference checks, and that intuitive sense of whether this person would be a good fit for your property.
Exactly. And if you're ever feeling unsure about a potential tenant or have questions about the screening process, don't hesitate to seek advice from a trusted property manager or attorney. They can provide invaluable guidance and help you navigate the complexities of tenant selection.
That's a great point. Sometimes seeking expert advice up front can save you a lot of heartache and hassle down the line. And speaking of expert advice, let's not forget to give another shout out to our sponsors, Flowers and Associates.
You got it. They're the go-to resource if you're interested in learning more about creating passive income through special needs housing. They offer free workshops that are packed with valuable information and strategies to help you boost and stabilize your rental income. Give them a call at 901-445-8148 to learn more.
Great advice. Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the wild world of problem tenants. We've covered a lot of ground today, from lease agreements and documentation to proactive communication and strategic tenant screening. Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding these common scenarios and implementing the strategies we've discussed, you'll be well equipped to navigate the challenges of being a landlord.
And remember, you don't have to face these challenges alone. There are resources available to help you every step of the way. We'll be back next Wednesday with another installment of the Problem Tenant Chronicles Volume 1, tackling even more tricky situations and providing you with actionable advice to thrive in the rental market. Until then, happy renting.
See you next week.